Greetings, friends of liberty. I found it heartening not long ago when, visiting a young nephew of mine at the Rugby school in Warwickshire, I saw the football games they played there. In the main, these involve a ball, sometimes made from an inflated pig bladder, and a goal across which one must carry it. These games have a long insular history amongst us Anglo-Saxons, and are often celebrated on holidays such as Shrove Tuesday. They are played as well on the continent, being known and played in France as La Soule, and in Italy as Calcio Fiorentino. Here in England, numerous monarchs, with arrogant notions of their prerogative, have attempted to outlaw such athletic contests. Edward II, for example, said, "For as much as there is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls from which many evils may arise, which God forbid, we command and forbid on pain of imprisonment such games to be used in the city in the future." Thankfully, however, our citizenry have uniformly ignored such royal presumption. Now, when conversing with a friend of my nephew, I learned that the boys playing these games sometimes agree to change the rules if they think a change might improve interest or render the game more challenging. In this way, we might say that the game undergoes experimentation, which is always in accord with their own desires. However, if we turn to those of you in 21st century America, we find the odd circumstance that male students in many colleges are not allowed to express their own desires, even just to play sports, never mind choosing their own specific rules. At the same time, female students who time and again express less interest in sports are in essence bribed to play more than they would. Truly a strange state of affairs. Such disrespect shown for the desires of students themselves, which colleges are supposed to honor. In today's book under review, Jessica Gavora's Tilting the Playing Field, School, Sports, Sex, and Title IX, we find a well-crafted and comprehensive description not only of this bizarre result, wrought on American colleges and universities by yet another anti-discrimination law, Title IX, but also of the bureaucracies and court systems which enforce and implement it. Ms. Gavora begins by describing her own very fulfilling experience playing basketball from the 4th grade on, being better than her peers, partly because she was already close to 6 feet tall, and partly because, loving the game, she practiced at home for hours on end by herself or with her brother. As she says, boys had little use for me, and I was an uninspired student. What saved me was sports. Through sports, she learned how to lose gracefully, how to reach ever higher levels of athletic excellence, and how to work efficiently and cooperatively with others. When she was in 4th grade, however, in 1972, Title IX of the American Civil Rights Act was passed. And whether or not this law was actually responsible for the vast increase in women playing sports that occurred around this time, Title IX got the credit for it from the liberal media and intelligentsia, and through them, the public. As she says, these efforts to tie all women's athletic achievement to Title IX find a receptive audience in the proud moms and dads of multiplying hordes of pigtailed soccer players today. And when the U.S. women's soccer team won the World Cup in 1999 against China, again, where did the credit go? Apportioned by the likes of race hustler Jesse Jackson and the ad mavens at Nike sneakers with their Title IX commercials, and the promoters of the women's NBA to Title IX. Of course, Title IX, as it was originally passed, and as it still is on the books today, was simply intended and written to outlaw discriminatory intent, not establish equality of outcomes. Its very words proclaim, "Nothing in the law shall be interpreted to require any educational institution to grant preferential or disparate treatment to the members of one sex on account of an imbalance with respect to the total number or percentage of persons of that sex participating in or receiving the benefits of any federally supported program or activity." It could hardly be clearer, and yet the practical rule by which it is interpreted in the end has come to be very different. All gendered activities should have equal proportions of men and women. Intent is irrelevant to this rule of proportionality. The switch in focus makes it much easier to interpret and bypass the entire need to prove discrimination at the individual level. How did the law come to mean something directly opposite to what the legislators wrote? Because either the judiciary in rulings or the relevant bureaucracies, such as the Office of Civil Rights and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, work together to enforce their own liberal preferences, in effect completely rewriting the law. Here are two examples. A. Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and its brave president, Vartan Gregorian, fought from 1991 to 1995 in the courts, spending millions of dollars to uphold an actual honest reading of Title IX. What had happened was that, with bargaining costs, Brown needed to cut their athletic department costs, and so chose to cut 2 women's teams and 2 men's teams. Brown was then sued by the Office of Civil Rights, even though Brown had the second most women's teams in the country after Harvard. Sued because they hadn't achieved the correct proportions, according to the Office of Civil Rights. Brown argued that it had provided equality of opportunity, even if the results weren't proportional to the gender balance of the student body. However, the case, having reached the Supreme Court, with a judgment in the lower courts against Brown, and despite Brown being backed by many other universities, former Republican heads of health, education, and welfare like Caspar Weinberger, the governing bodies of intercollegiate wrestling, swimming, and water polo, the American Council on Education, as well as numerous members of Congress, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, thus allowing the lower court's adverse ruling to stand. This default decision then intimidated hundreds of colleges and unis to follow OCR regs in compliance. B. The Office of Civil Rights' head, Norma Cantu, when assigned by President Clinton to lead that 700-plus person agency, used it to push the edge of the intimidation envelope, interpreting the law in her own deliberately false way, and then implying to colleges they'd be sued if they didn't comply with her regs. Here is another example. After the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals invalidated the use of racial preferences in both the University of Texas and all Texas unis that accepted federal funding, Cantu threatened to stop that federal funding to any university unless they continued using racial preferences. That is presumption on a cosmic scale. In other words, she gave a big middle finger to the appeals court ruling and only backed down when the Attorney General of the United States disagreed and Congress threatened in turn to withhold funding from her agency, the Office of Civil Rights. So here a bureaucrat, secure in her administrative power, refused to uphold the law. This is very common in the history of anti-discrimination law. Notably, Republican heads of the Office of Civil Rights had previously simply let claimants who felt they had a case come to them, which was much less aggressive. But not the Democrat, Norma Cantu. As Gavora says, in the first 19 months of Cantu's tenure, the Office of Civil Rights began 240 reviews of schools from which no civil rights complaints had been filed. In addition, she instructed her 10 regional offices to double the number of complaints they investigated. We might analogize this to a police chief who tells his traffic officers, I want you to double the amount of tickets you write this month. And the result of all this? The judiciary, staffed by compliant judges, approved and in sympathy with Cantu, rubber-stamped her legal persecutions. As Gavora writes, with a single exception, the aggrieved female athletes and their supporters in the professional women's groups prevailed in every suit they brought. As can be expected, such a mechanistic application of the proportionality law, utterly divorced from reality, has resulted in hundreds of sports tragedies befalling American secondary and collegiate institutions. One study found that from 1986 to 1997, in American higher education, 21,000 men's spots disappeared, a drop of 12%. Men's athletic scholarship aid declined by 10%. For their part, women gained 14,500 spots, an increase of 16%, with a corresponding jump in scholarships of 66%. Here are some of the tragic individual instances that make up these collective stats. A. Miami University in Ohio simply canceled their men's tennis, soccer, and wrestling programs to achieve this unnatural gender balance. And they did that even though no women's teams had charged unequal treatment. In other words, not a single person had complained. B. At Providence College in Rhode Island, the entire men's baseball team, which had had the best season in the school's history the previous year, was junked. Why? There was an 11% difference between the number of women on campus and the number of women playing sports. So by getting rid of the men's baseball team, that lowered the percent of men playing sports and made it closer to the women's percentage, thus avoiding potential litigation by Cantu. And all this, despite the fact, as Gavora says, no female athlete had filed a complaint of discrimination at Providence, and no investigation had found a pattern of discrimination that somehow had escaped complaint. It was persecution for persecution's sake, or more accurately, in the service of an ideology and their privileged ideologues. C. When a disgruntled girl didn't like being cut from Duke's football team as a kicker, she just sued under Title IX and won. D. In 1993, UCLA, citing Title IX pressure, dropped its men's swimming and diving teams, which had produced 22 Olympic medalists, including 16 golds. E. Some soccer moms in California, not liking that their daughters had to play in the winter while the boys got the same fields in the fall, sue the school district. And you Americans wonder why you have the most litigious society in the world? Unfortunately, the result was that the suit won and the girls' season was moved to the spring, which meant the girls had to forgo other sports like swimming and softball that they would have gotten to play in addition. F. The boys' sign on one baseball field being better than the girls, even though it was because the boys' parents had volunteered their time and money to make the boys' field and grass and sign better, and the parents of the girls' team hadn't. Doesn't matter. The boys' sign was painted over to make everything more equal. I'm not sure what they did about the boys having better grass. Maybe not water it? G. Of course, hardcore gender feminists, with their natural antipathy to men and instinct to privilege women by the coercive power of the state, like these results in sports so much that they figured, why not sue in other areas as well? Why limit it to just sports? And so they did sue more. Sociologically, this is called domain expansion. As Gavora says, the National Science Foundation gives out more than $100 million to undergraduate science, engineering, and mathematics programs each year. Why not demand gender equity here as well? And in this, Gavora believes that those feminists, disappointed that the Equal Rights Amendment hadn't made it into the Constitution, used Title IX as an alternative to cram their coercive preferences more and more down everyone's throats. Gavora devotes a significant part of the second half of the book on these areas, such as scholastic standardized testing and percentage of women in tech that have been attacked. Now let's turn to a number of interesting questions raised, the first being whether, as it is so often assumed, Title IX was the cause for the increase in women's sports participation over time. In this, Gavora brings in Charles Murray's trendline analysis. In trendline analysis, all you do is look at the previous trend, the line on the graph, to see whether an assumed cause, like Title IX at a certain point in time, here in 1972, actually played any causative role. And what this shows in this case is that 1A, Title IX was enacted at a time when the revolution in women's sports had already begun. As more and more girls and women demanded the opportunity to compete in athletics, more and more institutions complied without a federal enforcement bureaucracy looking over their shoulders. That's what happens in a free society. So, for example, as she says, before Title IX, 1 in 27 high school girls played sports. Today, that number is 1 in 3. But in 1972, the ratio had already risen to 1 in 9 from 1 in 27, which fact you'll never hear from the likes of Hillary Clinton or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. 1B. Secondly, Title IX required time to be implemented in institutions. And so even for a considerable period of time after 1972, the rise in participation cannot be attributed to the law itself, but instead, again, to the increasing desire of women to play sports. 1C. Thirdly, Title IX itself can thus be understood, at least in part, not as a cause, but as an effect, a symptom, an expression of the changing zeitgeist regarding the appropriateness of women playing sports. In other words, the very cause that led to increased female participation also likely led, at least in part, to the passing of the law itself. Effect, not cause. Number 2. A second point she makes, in general, is to describe the huge tag team of cooperation between lawyers like those found at the Women's Sports Foundation, whose main business is to sue colleges and their de facto charitable status. They're raking in huge amounts of money from liberal corporations and private donors who have bought into the coercive feminist ideology and helped to fund it. As Gavora notes, the strategy is to break the bank, forcing schools to spend so much to meet the gender quota that the corrupt, male-dominated edifice of collegiate sports would fall entirely and be replaced by gender equity. And if schools wouldn't spend on athletics, it would be on litigation. No need to wonder why American higher ed is becoming increasingly expensive. In addition, it should be emphasized that the Women's Sports Foundation is only one part of a coalition of liberal women's groups, trial lawyers, and gender equity advocates and consultants for whom Title IX is the sine qua non of existence. In other words, the very purpose of these groups being to fight tooth and nail to continually prevent colleges and unis from treating their athletes and students the way they want. In the famous decision against Brown University, previously mentioned, both a group called Trial Lawyers for Public Justice and the lawyers at the Women's Sports Foundations had gone shopping for a client at Brown University. They settled on Amy Cohen, the former captain of the ill-fated gymnastics team. Number 3. Another point to note is that in college, the relatively profitable college football programs subsidized the women's sports like basketball, water polo, and synchronized swimming, which no one wants to watch and would fund. Number 4. It has been understood by biologists for centuries that men are more widely distributed on the spectrum of ability than women. So, for example, there are more men morons and more men geniuses, more guys at either end of the spectrum. Or to put it conversely, women on average are more average. They are more grouped in the middle. This fact, in and of itself, means that there will always be imbalances by the sexes, both at the ends where more men are and in the middle where more females are. And so any legislation that tries to correct such imbalances will be fighting human nature and can never achieve its goal. Number 5. One of the deepest issues examined by Gavora is not only whether men and women differ generally in their interests, but also the more specific evidence on whether women, as it appears, care less about playing and watching sports statistically than men. Here, for example, she points out that one college president said, "I was at our football game last weekend, and I said to a colleague of mine as we looked at what must have been 100 men lined up in red, black, and white jerseys along the sidelines, I said, that's a part of the gender equity problem. There is no sport where 100 women will stand along the sidelines when only 22 get to play." In other words, not to put too fine a point on it, in sports, they're either on the field or they quit the team. Or we could say that, when it comes to sports, women definitely believe in learning by doing. B. In the famous case of Brown University, surveys showed vast differences of interest of applicants, with over 90% of those showing interest in dance, 56% in drama, and 66% in music being women. Interestingly, the Office of Civil Rights didn't sue Brown to raise the percentage of men in these cases. No, Title IX preferences and their accompanying legal privileges never worked to increase the percentages of men. Ever. In conclusion, this is a superb book, and although published back in 2002, remains still one of the best overall treatments of the damage Title IX has wrought, both in sports and other areas, to American higher education. I would give it an A- for its readability, very cogent treatment of relevant issues, while remaining under 200 pages. With an understanding that the issue of sports participation and interest can be understood if we just keep in mind that your women's teams in the National Basketball Association, from their abysmal crowd attendance and television revenue, make so little money that they are run at a loss and need to be subsidized by the humongous revenues earned by the men's teams with international stars like Luka Doncic, LeBron James, Nikola Jokic, and Stephen Curry. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.